Hi, my name is Erin, and I'm doing a presentation on the FAST assessment, a critical analysis of the FAST assessment. FAST assessment standing for Functional Analysis Screening Tool. So before I kind of dive into a lot of information about the assessment, I wanted to go, sometimes my slides have a mind of their own, sorry. Want to go a little bit about the history and the development of the tool. So the FAST was developed in the 1990s by Brian Iwata. And he did this kind of in response to noticing that a lot of people, when they were doing their functional analysis with both experimental and descriptive analyses, we're using a lot of these indirect methods of gathering information, such as the verbal reports, yes/no questionnaires, Likert scale type information, and knowing that they all had poor reliability and validity, but were being used quite a lot, and hypothesized really that these were being used mostly because people really liked having a consistently formatted interview, something that they could just use that was already pre-made and would yield the same results for every client every time, or in terms of like the kind of information they were collecting. They were really pretty easy to administer, and they did not take very much time to complete. So kind of taking this information into account, Iwata said, well, how about if I just kind of go with the flow and develop this tool that will do just those things. So kind of admittedly, he said that he knew going into this that reliability and validity were probably going to be an issue because, as he said before, all of these other indirect methods still had poor reliability and validity. But his goal was to create a tool that was consistent with the research on the functional analysis of problem behaviors, that he wanted to have something that was pre-made, ready to use for individuals to conduct interviews quickly, and something that would help direct the elements of a functional analysis so that it was not just the one thing that was determining the function and behavior, but it was one piece of a larger puzzle being used to kind of point down a path to determine the function and behavior. And definitely was something that was not intended to replace an FA, but was to be used in conjunction with it. So I did attach the FAST assessment to my discussion post here, in case you wanted to take a look at it as we talk about what it looks like. It might just be a little bit easier. I'll go over it quickly here, and then I do have it in a slide as well, but it's tiny and hard to see. So just in terms of the description of the tool, basically split into, it's one page, split into two sides of the page, so two columns. And on the left-hand side, just some general information about the client and the behavior that we're looking at. So just an overview of what the problem behavior is. And then on the right-hand side, it has 16 questions that you answer either yes, no, or there is a not applicable option. And each one of those questions corresponds with one of four maintaining behavior variables. And I'm going to go into a little bit more detail about what and why these are in just a second, but essentially they correspond to either being socially positive reinforced, social negative reinforcement, automatic positive reinforcement, automatic negative reinforcement. So kind of unique buckets, and like I said, we'll talk about them again in just a second. And then at the bottom of that right-hand side column is the scoring box. And basically, you just kind of, the category out of each one of those four that received the most yes responses is the category that points to the potential maintaining variable of that client's behavior. So we'll go into a little bit more detail of what this is. Again, on the left-hand side, that kind of overview component So there's some instructions for the interviewer and the informant. The informant is the person, obviously, who's giving the information about the client. Talks a little bit about their relationship information, or collects data on this. So how does that person know the individual? How long have they known each other? When do they usually see each other? What are their typical interactions? What do those things usually look like? And then let's talk about the problem behavior. What is our concern? What are we seeing? How frequently does it happen? How severe is it? When does it generally happen? Kind of time of day. Are there particular antecedents or consequences that are currently happening with that behavior? Or what is the current treatment, or what is currently being done when that behavior surfaces? So, as I said, kind of those 4 buckets, the yes/no question portion of the assessment is dividing into 4 categories of social positive reinforcement, and with those questions, are really looking at the client's access to attention or access to preferred items. So asking questions that would kind of get who is that what's maintaining this behavior for them. Social negative reinforcement would be looking at anything with demand or escape. Automatic positive reinforcement is anything that their behavior would generate that would create sensory stimulation for them. So they're reinforced by the sensory stimulation of that kind of automatic behavior. And then automatic negative reinforcement, looking for any pain attenuation or escape from pain. So the behavior would give them the ability to remove that kind of discomfort. Then the scoring summary box down at the bottom of that right-hand column. To be quite honest, it is one of the most, or maybe I say least complex scoring systems in terms of, something that you can do very quickly and very easily. So the first 4 items correspond to social positive reinforced items. 5 through 8 are socially negatively reinforced. 9 through 12 is the automatic positive, and 13 through 16 is automatic negative. And in that scoring box at the bottom, then it just has 1, 2, 3, 4 total. And items 1, 2, 3, 4, if you got items 1, 2, and 3 that were a yes, you circle those numbers, and then you put a 3 in that total. And then you do that for each kind of item or bucketed items, and whatever category has the most yeses would point toward the variable that's possibly maintaining that behavior. So again, this is kind of what the assessment looks like. Again, it's probably easier for you to see if you want to take a look at it from the discussion attachment, but it's kind of a brief overview of what it looks like. And again, it's just this one page. It's very short, and kind of a lot of information crammed into one space. So in terms of, when we talk about the FAST reliability and validity, as I said, the tool was developed in the 90s, in 1996. And really there has been little to no investigation of the reliability and or the validity of the tool for most of that time. It really wasn't until the 2010, 2011 when some of these other studies started to come out that were kind of tinkering with the idea of like, hey, maybe this isn't the most reliable or valid assessment out there. There were other studies that cited something about the FAST, either using it. So one study that I found, this Devlin, Healy, Leader, and Hughes in 2011, unfortunately, more or less, in the broader scheme of their study, but they did use the FAST, it appeared, to determine a function of behavior and develop a function-based intervention from the tool. Then we came out with Zaja, Moore, Van Ingen, and Rowan in 2011, who did do a reliability and validity study comparing the FAST, the FACT, and the QABF. And I'll talk a little bit about the results in just a second. And then another one that I found is, and obviously there are probably multiple studies that use the fast in some way or another, or mention the fast, like this one, and said, you know what, we see how this could be used, but we also see that there's really no psychometric data on it, and so instead of using this one, we're going to use something else that we think is probably going to be better suited towards our study. So just a little bit of that information kind of already surfacing out there in 2011, saying like, nobody's tested this assessment. We don't know exactly how well it works. I'm going to elect to use something else. And then in 2013, Iwata came along and he said, well, I'm going to publish my own article on the reliability and validity of my tool, and kind of see what all comes of it. So as I said, that Zaja et al. Study compared the QABF, the FACT, and the FAST, looking at self-injurious, stereotypic and aggressive / destructive behavior. And I'm not going to go into a ton of details about their study, but they looked at inter-rater reliability, test-retest reliability, and convergent validity. And at that time, like I said, there hadn't been any other studies on the psychometric properties of the assessment. So nothing had been published up until that point. This was really the first time that something was being published in terms of FAST reliability and validity. And so their results, they found, unfortunately, that the FAST scored the lowest of those three assessments in both reliability and validity. And they used something called the Cicchetti's interpretive guidelines that put kind of words to the metrics of each one of those measures. So inter-rater reliability, where they found it to be 0.48 to 0.71, Cicchetti's interpretive guidelines called that poor to good reliability. Test, retest fell into the fair to excellent reliability scale, and then internal consistency, unfortunately, was unacceptably poor. So the authors of this study, looking at the FAST and then the other two assessments, the QABF and the FACT, hypothesized that, well, maybe it's the length of the assessment, and then maybe the yes-no format, the restricted subscale ranges that are impacting the psychometric properties, and that's why we're getting low scores of reliability and validity on the FAST. In Iwata's study, he starts out kind of defending the decisions that he made in the creation of his tool, and it really does give some good background information as to why it is created and built the way that it is. So he talks about his yes or no format was a conscious decision that he intended to increase the reliability. So when you have fewer choices, less choices, more agreement. So saying that reliability was really inversely correlated with the number of choices. So he felt that yes, no would actually increase his reliability. And then talking about the categories of behavior, kind of those unusually divided or bucketed maintaining variables of behavior. He cited some large-scale studies that talked about behavior usually being maintained by one of these elements. Strangely enough, one of those large-scale studies was, again, his own. And so, again, it's just kind of like, I felt like it was kind of like self-analysis on self-analysis on self-analysis. But nevertheless, that is what his study found. And there was at least one other study that cited that a lot of behavior is maintained by those variables. So he felt like those were appropriate buckets to use. He also talked about delivery of tangibles, usually occurring in the context of a social situation. So potentially in the effort to be brief and succinct, we can combine those within this assessment tool. And then he also talked about how the MOS and the QABF used escape from task demands in a category in a similar way, categorized in a similar way in those assessments. And so felt like that would, he had kind of the ability to use that in the same way in his assessment. He also talked about the tool's intended purpose. So again, reiterating that this is not a tool to determine outright the function of behavior. It's not a function analysis tool. It is a preliminary interview tool that can be used to direct additional parts of a function analysis. It is meant to be a questionnaire that is pre-made for easy use. The people can kind of pick up and consistently use the same interview form each time. So talking a little bit about his study, in his reliability analysis, so the way that he did this is he had 151 participants, and for each one of those participants, he had 2 informants or 2 people fill out a fast. And so each individual had 2 fasts created on their behavior. And then they looked at how often those 2 assessments were in agreement with each other to determine that reliability. The mean overall agreement was less than the 80% criterion that we often see, scoring at 71.5%, and outcome agreement was at 64.8%. And he did the validity analysis. So all of the FAST assessments had been done already. They took those same 151 participants and ran functional analysis conditions on them. They used all of that data, presented it to a panel of experienced behavior analysts who did not know the outcomes that had happened with the FAST, and did a FAST functional analysis comparison. When they did this, unfortunately, they ran into a little bit of problem because, as we know, the reliability of the FAST had already been low. So a lot of the agreements between those 2 FAST assessments was not there. So then they had to take the functional analysis and compare it to each one of the outcomes of the FAST so that all of the functions were accounted for. Eventually, they just took comparisons of the FAST and the functional analysis with the FAST assessments that did have function agreement. So when those 2 assessments, FAST assessments, agreed, they compared that with the functional analysis, and they had an overall correspondence of 70.8%. So not exceptionally high in terms of validity, and demonstrating a definite lack of predictive validity. And Wada himself said, yeah, this assessment is really not adequate for anyone to develop a treatment plan with or treatment selection out of. So doing a kind of an additional critique of the tool, overall, very, very little research has been done on the reliability and validity, and what has been done has shown low reliability and validity, obviously. And also, it's strange a little bit, not ideal at all, that the main study was done by Iwata on his own tool. So generally, in research, it's probably not the preferred way to have the main investigator investigate and evaluate his own assessment. Another critique that I had was that I think it appears that there is potentially a lack of widespread information about what the intent of the assessment is. Why would somebody use it, or how would somebody use it? As I said, there were a couple studies, the one I mentioned, that did use the FAST to determine a function of behavior and build a treatment program from that. And that's really not the intention of what the tool should be used for. In terms of, utility, I have to say that the assessment has got to be probably one of the easier tools to use. It is uniform, so we don't need any additional organization of questions. You don't have to spend time recreating the wheel here. Everything is already laid out for you. It's on one sheet of paper and doesn't take much time at all to complete. It also creates consistency both within and across your clients. So even though the reliability of the tool itself is not high, you could argue that at least you're taking information and interviewing clients in the same consistent way every time. It is a jumping off point for directing functional analysis and functional analyses. And one pro to that is that if you have a whole bunch of people that fill out a FAST assessment for a client, you could potentially remove conditions that don't necessarily need to be in the functional analysis. So let's say that some of this behavior is really risky and you determine, well, I don't need this condition because the FAST is pointing to these other 2 or these other 3 behaviors, and we can just keep this condition out and make our functional analysis go a little more quickly. Obviously, when you remove a condition from a functional analysis, then you have the potential for a false negative, that you may make an error, so you just have to be mindful about that as well. Ability to develop follow-up interviews, so identifying idiosyncratic, antecedent, or consequent events, and just kind of taking that data and starting to narrow it down and drive down a path that will help really uncover the most accurate functions of behavior. So in terms of recommendations, I don't actually think of the FAST as a terrible tool. I think that it is a tool that knows its place. And so I think if you are going to use a tool, you need to ensure that you're using it in accordance with its intended purpose. Another recommendation would be to administer it to multiple individuals so that you can look for patterns and then develop a direction for function analysis, but making sure that you're doing that carefully so that we're not omitting conditions from a functional analysis that really should be there. Attempting to make other people aware of the purpose of the FAST when that's necessary. I think in terms of accuracy and treatment planning with ethical obligation, if we see somebody using a tool incorrectly, and there's a potential for that, I think, with this assessment, that's fairly great to ensure that other people are aware of what the purpose of it is and what it should really be used for. And then finally, as I've said, I think is just use the tool as a descriptive tool with additional assessments to identify the behavioral function. So making sure that the FAST is one of the assessments that you're using in your toolbox of tools to really accurately identify what the function of the behavior is and create a treatment plan from there. The page of references. I really appreciate your time. Please let me know if you have any questions. Have a great Sunday.